Well, I was supposed to come here today to talk to you about web accessibility. Unfortunately, on my flight from Los Angeles to Pittsburgh, my talk was disabled. So I'm actually going to spend the next 45 minutes explaining to you how to re-enable it. If you've ever thought that air travel with a disability might be a fun thing that you would want to do at some point, don't. I don't recommend it. If you want to follow along with the sources that I have used to put this talk together, there is a link to a GitHub repository with everything nicely laid out. There is also a QR code there, which you can use to scan on your phone. That will bring you to the same sources repository. Usually, when I give this talk, I would have an acknowledgement section at the end. Unfortunately, this time, I cannot do that. Because I would like to dedicate this talk today to my friend, the late Annie Braxton. She was one of the people who helped me put this talk together all the way back in 2019 when I started giving it, and she passed away about a month ago as a result of an accident. Some of her art is featured later in the talk. If I need to take a moment, I'm sorry, you'll have to bear with me. I do not expect to get through this without crying. So, who am I? Hello! I'm the person standing in front of you. My name is Dawn Cooper. In my day job, I am a cloud tinkerer, sometimes with a side of security. The most fun that I've had recently was working with our security team to set up a new set of alerts that we were going to plug into our detection system, and then testing them all. 547 alerts later. But the reason that I'm here is because I am an accidental accessibility advocate. We will unpack that one in a minute. Outside of work, I am an occasional author and kitchen alchemist. Sometimes that ends really well, sometimes it ends really badly. I am also a raging sports ball fan. Regrettably, I do not have Pittsburgh Pirates or Pittsburgh Penguins or Pittsburgh Steelers gear, and many of the other options I think would probably have got me run out of town. So, accidental accessibility advocate. The accessibility advocate bit, yes, that's fairly self-explanatory. But how does one become an accidental accessibility advocate? Well, that might have something to do with things like this. This is in the UK. This is our excellent disabled toilet, which is, as you would note from the sign next to it, down the stairs. The usefulness of a disabled toilet that is down a set of stairs, that's quite debatable. Now, you might think that these sorts of situations only happen in, they only happen in the abstract. On the contrary, here is a photograph from a trip that I took to New Zealand last year. You cannot see the sign in front of that door, so let's zoom in on that a little bit. Door out of order. Please use the other side to exit the building. We apologize for any inconvenience. What that sign doesn't tell you is the other side was down a set of stairs, and we ended up having to get security to let us out through an alternative exit through a shopping mall. But this doesn't even just happen in New Zealand. This photograph was taken in San Francisco, right outside my employer's office. And you will note, there was, at one point, a curb cut there. There is now no longer a curb cut there. And this is a great experience for me, because whenever I go to my employer's HQ in San Francisco, I forget that the damn thing is there, and sometimes I have to walk around half a block to avoid it. So before we get any further, let's define a few terms. According to the Americans with Disabilities Act, a disability is a condition which substantially limits one or more major life activities. That's a deliberately broad definition, and that's because the ADA was designed to encompass all sorts of disabilities. If it interferes with your sleeping, your eating, your ability to get around, your ability to perform tasks of basic daily living, that would be classified as a disability. Accessibility is not something that's easily defined in most legislation, so we'll go with a simpler definition: the degree to which an activity can be done by everyone. And you will note, accessibility is not just about disability. There was a famous case back from, I believe it was about 2009, about HP and their racist webcam, where a black man went out and he bought a brand new HP laptop with face tracking capabilities on the webcam. It could not track his face. When he gave it to his white colleague, it could track her face. That's not a disability issue, but it is an accessibility issue. Then there's adaptive technology, which is essentially tools that disabled people use to improve access. And that can be really simple. This is a piece of adaptive technology. That wheelchair over in the corner that I used to get up onto the stage is adaptive technology. But as we have entered into the world of, or a more technologically enabled world, adaptive technology has increasingly become more complex and more software-based. That will become relevant later. And, warning, this is where we get political for a second. There are broadly two different models which can be used to understand disability. The first of those models is the medical model, which is illustrated over here by our blob sitting in a wheelchair being comforted by a vaguely medical-looking blob. What that essentially says is that disability is something that we need to try and fix. Disability is something to be resolved. On the other side, you have the social model, where the argument is that the problem is not so much disability, it's the fact that the world is not built for people with disabilities to exist in it. And the social model of disability gets you to situations like the one on the right, where you have this lady in a wheelchair playing some form of adaptive sport. It's not the person with a disability that you need to alter, it's the environment. Now, the medical model has its utility, but for the purposes of this talk, let's think about everything in terms of the social model of disability. What we're aiming to do is not to solve the disability, but solve for the constraints which make it a disability. And I'm at PyCon. This is a tech conference. This is part of your job. Even if all you ever do is write CLI tools, there are still aspects of accessibility which are important to consider when you write these sorts of low-level tooling. If you're doing anything with web interfaces, anything with apps, this is doubly important, particularly if you're doing UI or UX. Accessible design is good design. This does not mean that good design is inherently accessible. It does mean that if you design something accessibly, it is generally designed better, and if you start with good design, it is generally easier to make it accessible. Let's illustrate. This is arngren.net, and I did not have to look very hard to find this. It is on a plethora of top 10 worst websites ever lists. I mean, maybe it would make more sense if I spoke Norwegian, but you've got a whole lot of pictures all over there, not really any sense of classification. Everything's a bit higgledy-piggledy. And this generally means that it will also be very difficult for people with accessibility requirements to interact with this website, for a few reasons. The layout is really illogical. That's going to be difficult for autistic people, people with ADHD, people with sensory processing issues, people with vision issues. There are a whole lot of scenarios where color is the only way that information is being conveyed on this website. There's also the issue that because you've essentially got a bunch of bits stuck on a web page all higgledy-piggledy, you don't have the anchors that a screen reader would use to try to navigate their way around this website. So your screen reader is going to be very confused about what order it should do this in. Then we have distinctive design. This is Ling's Cars, or it was Ling's Cars. Unfortunately, Ling Valentine has recently retired, and the main Ling's Cars page has gone back to something more normal in design. But the Ling's Cars Museum, which is what this used to look like when I put together this talk in 2019. I mean, Ling's face is animated, the traffic lights are animated, the UK painted tongue sticking out of the mouth is animated. You've got a great big YouTube video on the front of the page, and my favorite bit about this, which I couldn't get into the original screenshot in 2019, was the Boris Brexit guarantee, which was an animated GIF of Boris Johnson right below that YouTube video to advertise the fact that after Brexit, the cost of leasing your car from Ling's Cars was not going to go up. Now, Ling's Cars is a brand. Ling's Cars is famous for a reason, and it's very much built around the personality of Ling Valentine, the owner and founder. But if you want to take a website that is designed distinctively and make it accessible, there is extra work that you need to do. And I will say, to their credit, over time, Ling's Cars actually did this fairly well. You've got issues around whether animation should be automatically enabled, having the facility to turn that off. If you have a distinctive design, you have to be a lot more careful about the information that you actually present to someone navigating this website with a screen reader. Again, Ling's Cars, towards the end of its life, did this really well and with the same personality as the website. And then you also have the case of you've got lots of color there, you've got lots of extra information, so how do you make that navigable for people who might find that difficult? Let's look then at some good design. I'm actually using the older version of GitHub here because I think it's a better example. But this is software that probably a lot of us use every day. And GitHub does a few interesting things here which are not necessarily apparent to people who are not particularly involved in UX. If you take a look at that top bar up there, next to the search, you've actually got pull requests, issues, marketplace, explore. Those are essentially anchors for places that you might want to go a lot of the time on GitHub. Makes it much easier if you're a screen reader user. Makes it much easier for people with sensory processing issues to just pick up on it and go, okay, that's where I want to go. GitHub is a really good example of good design. This is actually the GitHub page for the NVDA free and open source screen reader for Windows. It was created by two blind people, and NVDA uses GitHub as a means of tracking issues because it is also relatively accessible for its user base, i.e. screen reader users. There are many resources for accessible design. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are kind of the canonical one, but they're also very information dense. The Accessibility Project has produced an accessibility checklist, which is much simpler and more digestible look at some of these sorts of things. I don't talk much about intellectual disabilities in this talk, but if you want to design for people with intellectual disabilities, the US Federal Plain Language Guidelines are the place to go for that. They're written by the US federal government. They basically lay out, if you want to convey information to people with intellectual disabilities, here is how you do it. I also highly recommend Christy Veer's video on iPhone accessibility features. Christy Veers is a blind lady who actually put this video together to show everything that she is able to do with the iPhone. Apple has some really, really good accessibility features in the iPhone. And this is indicative of what you can do if you think beyond, okay, here's the guidelines, and think about what's possible. It has a Braille keyboard. It has haptic feedback. These are really, really useful things if you're blind or have low vision. You can automate some of this, although not all of it. There's a whole list in there's a link to a whole list in the sources. Beware of accessibility overlays. I have a whole different talk on that, but that's not this talk. The starting point that I would generally recommend is the Axe Core Accessibility Testing Library. It's what a lot of places use. It's very robust. It also tends to be fairly good about not trying to test for things that you can't really test for. If you're designing for colorblind users, the Color Oracle desktop filter is a really good place to start. One of the reasons why I recommend that rather than any of the browser plugins that you can get is you can also use it on desktop apps. You can't do that with the browser plugins. The Paciello Group, which is one of the early accessibility consultancies, also produced a list of basic screen reader commands. So if you are building a UI and you want to actually test it with a screen reader, you can go fire up that list of commands, procure yourself some sort of screen reader, and go through. And I do recommend doing that just to get a sense of what it's like. One of the very few aspects of accessibility that you can't ask people to test for relates to photosensitive epilepsy. We're going to get back to that in a minute with one of the case studies, but if you want to do testing to ensure that elements on your app or website are not going to be a problem for people with photosensitive accessibility, the photosensitive epilepsy analysis tool, which is a bit of a mouthful, is what you want for that. It basically has automated detection thresholds, and it's looking for the types of flashing, flickering, strobing elements that would be a problem for people with photosensitive epilepsy. Guidelines are great. Guidelines are a really, really good starting point if this is your first interaction with this and you want to learn about it. However, when it comes to web accessibility, guidelines do not tell the whole story. You may have a user base that is skewed towards people with one particular type of disability. You may have people who need features that are not covered in the accessibility guidelines. There are a few places, most notably trying to put white text on blue buttons, where the accessibility guidelines can actually be kind of misleading. So guidelines are a really, really good starting point. But in order to understand the whole story of how we do web accessibility, we need to drill down a bit. So let's look at how this can go wrong. Now, if you have read the spiel for this talk, I promised you a household name, and pretty much everyone here works in tech. So our first household name for today is Atlassian Confluence. How many people here have used Confluence before? Pretty much everyone. Brilliant. It's a wiki and documentation platform. You can set up Confluence spaces, you can create pages in them, and then you can use those pages to organize, categorize, and make available information to other people. So if I wanted to go and create a space somewhere in Confluence, I would bring up this handy dialog. I would select the space that I wanted to create the page in. I would click on one of the page templates, and then I would click the Create button. That sounds really simple, doesn't it? There you go. That's your page. Not quite. Let's go back and take another look at that for a second. Because you would think, given that this is my talk, that I would be the person who had created that page. I am not. This page was created by someone called Matthew Gregory, who all the way back in 2019, when I first developed this talk, was my manager. So why was it that Matthew Gregory, and not me, was the person who created this page? Well, because when I tried to bring up the interface on the zoomed-in screen, I got this. Yeah. That create button, it's cut off the bottom of the screen. Oops. That's not so good, is it? Because the options within the pop-up there can be scrolled, but the pop-up itself cannot. Essentially, the work that has been done on resizing, it's just like, okay, resize the whole thing on the page. Don't take into account the page boundaries. Really simple mistake to make. The trouble is that if you're me and you're a user of a magnified screen and you want to go create a Confluence page all the way back in 2019, you've got to ask one of your colleagues to do it. So how do we improve it? To Atlassian's credit, I have actually done user testing for accessibility for them since then. Their products have got a lot better. But this is still the best case study that I've found of this sort of issue. So what I would recommend you do here, make sure that your UI elements are all scrollable and that nothing is cut off by the bottom of the screen. If you have UI elements which resize dynamically, if you have pop-ups, those need to resize dynamically as well. You also need to give people the ability to open and close pop-ups, so the toggles need to be there, they need to be viewable by screen readers. The pop-up needs to actually be navigable as well if you're using a screen reader. It's no use to bring up the pop-up, but the screen reader's just looping through the underlying screen. The best way to deal with this sort of thing, again, is get someone who uses magnified text to test your application, or just hit Control or Command plus, depending on which operating system you're using. Try it yourself. See how the elements resize. See whether they resize dynamically. See whether everything is scrollable. I promised you household names. Atlassian's only a household name for people in tech, so let's look at part 2 of how this goes wrong. let's talk about Domino's Pizza. Is their food good? I frankly don't know. I've never actually tried it, but I am informed that if one is in the US and one wants to order themselves a pizza, they can do it through Domino's Pizza. Except if you're a blind screen reader user. And I'm not just saying that. There's actually a lawsuit. Robles v. Domino's Pizza LLC. Plaintiff Guillermo Robles accesses the internet using screen reader software, which vocalizes visual information on websites. Domino's operates a website and app that allows customers to order pizzas and other products for at-home delivery or in-store pickup and receive exclusive discounts. On at least 2 occasions, Robles unsuccessfully attempted to order online a customized pizza from a nearby Domino's. Robles contends that he could not order the pizza because Domino's failed to design its website and app so his software could read them. That is the actual text of an appeals judgment, which is linked in the sources, for the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in the US, finding for plaintiff Guillermo Robles and against Domino's Pizza. This was the court case which established that websites are essentially places of public accommodation. If you have a website, if you have an app, it needs to be accessible by a screen reader. If you want to sell your pizza to someone, you need to also be able to sell it to a blind person who uses the screen reader to see the text. Because if it was late at night and I really wanted a pizza and I was trying to navigate Domino's Pizza's website through a screen reader and I couldn't do it, I would feel something like that. Long day at the office? What do you mean I can't order a pizza from you? Oops. And the takeaway here is applications do actually have to be specifically designed to work with screen readers. I am not a UI UX person, and the UI UX elements that you deal with if you deal with this are going to be very different. So I'm not going to tell you exactly how to do this, just to say your buttons, containers, and other widgets need to be defined correctly. They need to be labeled, they need to be tagged, they need to be logically ordered and navigable in such a way that screen readers can get around them. A couple of other really common issues for screen reader users. Also playing videos. I mean, I could just as easily have used the websites of many, many news sites as an example here. They all have also playing videos, and all the also playing videos talk over screen readers. Similarly, pop-up ads. If you do not code them correctly, they will actually take screen readers to a new page, which can be very jarring for the screen reader user who's suddenly hearing a lot of image, container text, image, and doesn't actually know that their focus has been changed, so they don't know how to get out. So how do we improve it? Pet peeve, mine, probably most of the tech industries. Let people decide whether they want to play videos instead of just hitting the autoplay button on them. It's bad design, and it's particularly a problem when it essentially makes your website inaccessible to the vast majority of screen reader users. If you have pop-up elements, make it easy for keyboard navigators and screen reader users to ignore or close them. Make them aware that the pop-up element is what they're actually in. Make sure that they can get to the toggle which will allow them to shut the thing down. For the UI piece as a whole, it will not solve all your problems, but if you start with an accessible component library, that is going to make your life a lot easier when you get to the point of then ensuring that everything is correctly ordered and correctly tagged. Again, I do not know what the accessible component libraries are around for Python. Many of you may know. If you do know, please tell me. But what you're essentially looking for is it's something which is appropriately labeled, appropriately tagged, presents you with the containers to actually put things like alt text in yourself. The best way to ascertain whether a user interface is usable by screen reader users, put on a blindfold, cover your screen, bring up the basic screen reader commands on a second window, try it yourself. You will not get all of the information that a daily screen reader uses, but it will give you a very good idea very quickly of where the big pain points might be. How many people here remember GeoCities? Cool, this audience skews older, and I feel weird saying that, because Yahoo killed GeoCities in 2019, the year that I started developing this talk. But for anyone here who doesn't remember what websites developed with GeoCities looked like, it was generally something like this. You've got your clip art text, you've got your dancing penguin, you've got a whole mess of colors, you've got your broken links. The only way that you could really make this more of a GeoCities website is by putting the bar of rainbow dancing Kirby's across the top. The trouble with GeoCities, GeoCities was great because it opened up web design to a whole lot of people who might never have done it otherwise. The trouble with GeoCities is that some people whose entire web design experience was GeoCities have now entered into the workforce and have decided that it would be a really good idea to take some of these design principles from the GeoCities days and apply them to their corporate websites. Which is a bit like taking your fancy corporate website, we are very amazing and we will show you why, and putting a Nyan Cat across the top of it, which is not something that I would recommend unless you are in an extremely niche field. Now, I said remember the thought about photosensitive epilepsy. I have a friend who works in the tech industry who has photosensitive epilepsy, and she heard about a particular company who will remain unnamed to protect the guilty, working in the tech industry. She decided that she wanted to check them out. So she went to their website, and they had a giant strobing pink element which covered about the top 2/3 of the screen, so probably down to where the "We Are Very Amazing" text starts. Went to this website, she saw this element, and she promptly had a seizure. And that meant that the enterprising marketing manager for this particular company was on the other end of a telephone call that I really suspect he didn't want to get. Oops. This is one of the really important ones because this is where you can actually cause people major health problems. Photosensitive epilepsy is a spectrum from mild to severe, and the friend in question did have a more severe version of photosensitive epilepsy, but flashing, flickering, strobing effects, particularly highly saturated red, highly saturated pink, those are the really big problems for people with photosensitive epilepsy. Even more so if they are high contrast. If you're going from like dark blue to dark green, that's not as big of a problem, particularly because of the lack of contrast. But any like big strobing element that's the top 2/3 of your screen and is red or pink, that's going to be a problem. So how do we improve it? Well, simply avoid using these effects if you can. If there is any other way to do this without the flashing, flickering, or strobing effect, that is what you should be doing. If you do need to use these effects, make sure that they are as small as possible. Do not cover the top 2/3 of your screen with a giant strobe light. Make sure that they are low contrast. Again, if that had been going, even if that strobe had been there, if it had been going from blue to green, it wouldn't have been as big of a problem. Don't use the saturated reds, saturated pinks. Some oranges can be a problem as well, but that's the part of the spectrum that's a really big problem for photosensitive epilepsy. Ideally, if you have to do this, either give users the option to disable flashing effects and animations, or even better, leave them off to start with and give people the option to enable them if you want them to be able to experience that. Now, there is a certain amount of precedent for people with disabilities being involved in integrated sports. And I'm not just talking about kids level integrated sports. This goes all the way up to the Olympics. On the left, we have Reto Ildiko, the Hungarian fencer. On the right, we have Im Dong-hyun, the Korean archer. Both disabled, both fairly successful. However, this case study is not talking about traditional sports. In this case study, we're talking about esports, specifically League of Legends, which for anyone who has never played it, is essentially, if you want to boil it down to something, basically a 5-on-5 or a 5 versus 5 tower defense game. You have various characters, or champions, which you can pick between, and they have various different abilities. And this case study is about the champion Tahm Kench, the titular catfish. He was the first character in League of Legends to be introduced with a mechanic called Grey Health. If you look at the screenshots that you've got there, you can see that part of his health bar is red on one side and green on the other. Then there's a little bit at the end which is lighter red and lighter green. And then there's a great big chunk which is grey. That's the grey health, which is basically a shield. And what this means is that at this point, Tahm Kench here is essentially unkillable. That looks fine, right? But if we put a colorblindness filter over that, particularly on the red side, which is the left side for anyone who is colorblind, which is the enemy side, that's not quite so clear. And the problem was that this was not just an issue with the standard red and green, this was also an issue in the colorblind mode. With somewhere between 8 and 10% of the population, mostly men, being colorblind, it was inevitable that there would eventually be a tweet from a professional player like this. If you didn't know, I'm colorblind, along with 2 other members of my team. All 3 of us can't see what health he's at in colorblind mode. Oops. Because this is their job, right? And you've got a team of 5 people, and 3 of them can't actually tell whether this catfish is nearly dead or has this huge grey health shield and is impossible to kill right now. Most colorblind people can't tell the difference between red and green, and that's a very big problem for a lot of obvious reasons, because we use red and green to indicate a lot of things. Colors that colorblind people can't see, as you saw from the filter, will generally look grey or black. But the key issue here is colorblind people, if they're presented with colors that they can't see, they're going to be using contrast to tell the difference. So you've got Tahm Kench here, and the key problem is the lack of contrast. So how do we improve it? Use a contrast checker to ensure that elements will be viewable. This is in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. They actually have ratios for this. And even if you do have a colorblind mode, try putting the colorblindness filters over it. You can never get the colors perfect. Even better, get colorblind people to test it. 8 to 10%, most big corporations are going to have at least a few people who are colorblind who can test it for you. Again, to their credit, Riot Games did resolve this really quickly, but it's the sort of thing that could have been picked up by that sort of user testing. When you develop software, there's not just red and green color blindness, so make sure that you have modes for achromatopsia, which is people who have no color vision whatsoever, and blue color blindness as well is a thing. Even before I started working at Slack, Slack's accessibility team are incredible humans. They do that. Slack has a tritanopia, which is the blue color blindness mode. And another important aspect with colorblindness is to use meaningful icons to indicate different elements and states. So that's not just like you slap a square or a circle or a triangle on it. What you would be looking for is, a big tick, a big cross, or text that indicates that information. Don't make color the sole way that you convey the information. It's 2025, and it feels like the time since early 2020 has gone really fast. Speaking of lawsuits, did you know that the White House during the COVID-19 pandemic got sued for not providing sign language interpretation for people? That's the reason why more recently, if you watch US government press conferences on your television, you will see they actually have hired sign language interpreters. And that's because it can be really important for people for whom sign language is their first language, people who can't hear, to be able to gain whatever information is in the press conference quickly, like the health guidelines are changing, or you need to evacuate today because there is a tornado coming. Sign language, however, is not the only way that we can convey information to people who cannot hear. Deaf people, hearing impaired people. Another way that we can do that is captioning. Shout out to the captioner down there. Lots of people will say, okay, great, you can do this with AI. That gets you tweets like this one from disability advocate Cal Montgomery. If you value us equally and want us to participate fully, we need full access to the Pulse briefing with enough lead time to absorb it. That chance is gone for the year, which means that you have just sabotaged your own legislative agenda by leaving advocates unprepared. What's the Pulse briefing, you ask? That's how the AI transcription engine rendered the word policy in a policy briefing from one of the major disability organizations in the United States. Again, There are organizations that do this really well. This American Life, the NPR podcast, uses a combination of auto-generated transcriptions and then having a human go through and edit them. They do indicate it's produced for the ear and designed to be heard, but if you are not able to listen to it for whatever reason, they provide a reasonably accurate transcript, which will give you the pertinent information. But not every organization does this. On the other hand, we've got The Guardian, a newspaper which started in the UK and has now gone worldwide. And as illustrated by this article by their then head of audio, Guardian Podcasts Mono Transcripts, The Guardian's approach to transcribing their podcast information is that they don't do it at all. They claim that you can get substantially similar information from their articles. However, what you've essentially done is you've just taken all of the nuance or all of the information that you might be able to get from a podcast format, and you've made it completely inaccessible to anyone who relies on transcripts for whatever reason. Oops. Because text-reliant people aren't necessarily deaf or hard of hearing. Autistic people, people with sensory processing disorder, people who are on a loud train might all need to use captions or transcripts in order to get that information from something that is presented in audio format. So how do we improve it? Provide transcripts for any spoken audio, caption your videos. That's fairly simple. The automated transcription software will not do it for you. It will do a passable first job. These live captioners are brilliant. They will do a much better job than the automated transcription software does. But even if you have a transcript produced by a live captioner, you should have a human review it and correct it before it is published. One aspect is Stranger Things on Netflix was really the first very popular franchise to do this. There's a lot of nuance, like This American Life said, in the audio that is not captured by captions or transcripts normally. So you want the captions and transcripts to describe things like changes in vocal tone, any background noise that might be happening, music that might be playing. For the text-reliant person who is using your captions or transcript, it gives them a richer, deeper experience. Hacking an artificial pancreas. We can read that two different ways. We could either be hacking together an artificial pancreas, or we could be hacking into an artificial pancreas. In fact, this case study covers both. This is a Medtronic Minimed insulin pump. They are now obsolete for reasons which we are about to detail. But these Medtronic Minimed insulin pumps had an absolutely fascinating security flaw, which had diabetics hunting down these obsolete insulin pumps. What you could actually do was the insulin pumps were connected to a remote, and you would tell the remote basically how much insulin to deliver. Some very clever hackers worked out that what you could essentially do was, because that communication channel was unsecured, you could take the data from a continuous glucose monitor, put a little bit of bridge code in between. That bridge code is still around. It's called OpenAPS. Go look it up. It's really cool. And then you could, over that unsecured frequency, feed it straight to the insulin pump. Small problem, that also made these Medtronic insulin pumps vulnerable to hacker attacks. And there was a lot of back and forth about this, and the FDA didn't really do very much. They issued an alert on Medtronic insulin pump security. Kind of went, okay, yes, this vulnerability exists. And then some people went, actually, we don't think the FDA is taking this sufficiently seriously, which led to the news headline, these hackers made an app that kills to prove a point. At which point, Medtronic finally recalled the vulnerable Minimed insulin pumps. Oh dear. This is also an accessibility issue. Security on medical devices is really important because you're talking about people's lives here. Again, in other talks, I've enumerated many other examples of this, but the OpenAPS Medtronic Minimed insulin pump scenario is absolutely emblematic of all of the double-edged swords here. If you are regulated by an external organization, they may not tell you about these issues quickly. They may not even tell you about them at all. You do not know unless you do some sort of robust testing before you actually bring the thing to market. In terms of other ways that we can improve it, yes, conduct penetration testing before the device goes to market. Get experts in that sort of hardware penetration testing to do it for you. But some of these things can be solved by simply sitting down and enumerating the possible attack vectors. What might we need to do? What might someone who wants to do these sorts of things maliciously be able to do with our unsecured insulin pump? If you get told about security vulnerabilities, respond to them promptly. The really sad aspect of this, actually, is the Minimed insulin pumps, these unintended uses, are a business opportunity. There were talks about creating a closed-loop system, continuous blood glucose monitor hooked up to the insulin pump directly, essentially the artificial pancreas all in one. I don't know if that ever happened. I know Medtronic hadn't got to it as of the last time I looked, which was about a year ago. You can now get more secure insulin pumps, which still allow you to do the bridge code, but these sorts of things, like, really smart people can produce really cool things, but the security aspect is also important because you can kill people by giving them the wrong amounts of insulin or withholding it altogether. You know, I said sometimes I have problems. This case study concerns me because when I started giving this talk all the way back in 2019, I thought, okay, if I'm going to stand up here and pretend to be an expert on this, I need to actually make sure that I have some idea of what people in the web accessibility industry are talking about. And one of the ways at the time that I got a lot of my information about what was going on in the tech industry was through LinkedIn. So one day, I am scrolling through my LinkedIn feed, and I see, okay, a web accessibility consultant is giving a talk at this venue, this time, on this topic. And I thought, great, cool. I know some things about this. I know more about what concerns me and a little bit more about what concerns my friends and other people that I know, but there always has to be something that I can learn from an expert in the field. So I left work early. I took a train to the venue to discover this. Yeah, that's a set of stairs. That wasn't the only set of stairs. There were actually 3 sets of stairs that you had to get up before you could get to level 1, where you could then get the elevator to where the talk was being delivered. Because I am extremely bloody-minded, I crawled my way up the stairs. I sat through this web accessibility consultant's talk. I described it with my friend Annie and some of the other friends that I workshopped this talk with. I described it as basically being like a Roomba just sitting at the bottom of the stairs repeatedly going error 406, which, for those of you who are not well versed in HTML error codes, means not acceptable. And he said to me, this is not my drawing style, but I will draw it for you. And there it is. Sorry. So at the end of this talk, I was sitting there and I just looked at this web accessibility consultant. I said to him, does it strike you as ironic that you're giving a talk about web accessibility in an inaccessible building? And he looked back at me and went, you know, I hadn't even considered that. I don't think I need to explain the irony here, but let's do the incident review anyway. PyCon US is brilliant at this, so take your example from here. Make sure that your venues are wheelchair accessible. Make sure that they have disabled bathrooms. Provide quiet spaces and adaptive technology. So we've got the captioner over there. Hearing loops are another really good one. Audio descriptions of slides, sign language interpreters can be very useful depending on your audience. The most important thing to do is to make sure that people with disabilities are included in these discussions about accessibility. I would not have been able to get here and get on the stage to speak to you if I hadn't been able to talk to the organizers about what needed to happen to make sure that that was going to work. So ask yourself, if you don't know of any disabled people, if there aren't any in your communities, if you don't work with any, who's not in the room and why aren't they here? So, to recap, accessibility benefits everyone, not just disabled people. It benefits people who are on a busy train. It benefits parents with small children and pushchairs. And the best way to deal with accessibility is to build it into your design principles from the start. It's not just about the web accessibility bit, though. Other issues, security risks, can be accessibility issues, particularly if you are dealing with medtech. Thorough testing is really important, and sometimes that means you get someone like me to come and test the thing for you. But if you can't, think about things that disabled people might need to do differently. And when someone comes to you with a complaint or raises an issue or says, hey, this doesn't work how I think it should, listen to your users. Thank you to all of the people who helped me put this talk together. Thank you again, particularly to Annie, who is no longer with us. Thank you to all of you for being here. Thank you to PyCon, the speakers, the sponsors. If you have questions, I'll be around. I'm not going to get time to take any of them, so we'll take it outside. But there is an email address there, and that is a GitHub repository with a link to all of the previous talks that I've done. The video for this and the transcript, thank you captioners, will also go up there once it's released. And that's that.